Hi, welcome to the exegetical task explanation. The first video here under the exegetical tasks will give an overview of the 15 exegetical tasks and give a detailed explanation of the first of those tasks. This video will be rather short. Again, if there's something that's not understood by the time that you finish watching the video and reading the appropriate sections in fee, be sure that you contact me because you will need to turn in something before class time next time. I have a different document up on my screen. This is the same document that you will have received in your student portal along with your other course documents. This one is called the exegetical tasks. This belongs to a basic way, a step-by-step process, a basic way to interpret the biblical text. So, you have my name here at the top and where I'm adapting this from. It's coming from the fee book, but this is an adaptation for a 3-credit hour course as opposed to a much larger open-ended project. If you were writing a commentary, you would be changing a lot of this to open-end everything because you're going to examine every single thing, overturn every leaf. We're not doing that in this class. You're going to focus on one paragraph within Galatians, and you're going to overturn a set number of leaves as you work through this passage. All right, I want you to see how these are laid out. There's 3 general areas that we're covering with the 15 tasks, and some of them are historical, some of them are literary, some of them are theological. And within the literary category, there's a lot of different things happening. So, task 1 is literary context of the book. That's the big one. It's how does the book fit with itself internally, the whole book. The second one is the historical context of the whole book. And next, you're going to be already having selected a passage. And so, number 3, you're going to be confirming the limits of the passage. Where does my passage really start and really end? That's a big question for number 3. And the section 2 in fee is a main section you want to read for that. Literary context of the passage. It's a lot like number 1, except now you're not focused on the whole book. You're focused on just your passage. And there's several sections in fee that relate to doing that. Fifth, you have the historical context of the passage. It's a lot like number 2, but instead of focusing on the whole book, you're now focusing on the passage. Number 6 is divided into 2 steps. You have a provisional translation, and then you have a comparison with other translations. Both of these steps are time intensive, and so it's divided into 2 for us. All right. Number 7, the sentence flow. That also is a literary step. 9 is textual matters. It's really hard to decide which category this fits in most. It most often affects literary things rather than theological things. So we put it here, but it could easily impact historical or theological matters. The next is grammatical matters. This is related to syntax, and fee section 6 is related to that. Then we come to word studies. Word studies are of multiple types. It depends on the word. You have cultural words, which are historical, often in nature. They're related to the backgrounds of the text. You have keywords. This is the one the author uses in a particular way or in a certain frequency. And then you have theological words that impact our understanding of theology. And there's a separate section in fee for each of these. Then you have the logic of structure. That's a literary task. Rhetorical analysis. This is often a historical thing. It's related to how rhetoric worked at that particular time in history. Then the theological context. That one is obviously under the theology category. Commentary reading. It's hard to categorize this, but you're going to, once you narrow down and really study your passage, your paragraph that you're doing your exegesis project on, you're going to overturn a lot of different commentaries on just your passage and see what they have to say, see how they inform your decision-making process. And so that could be historical, it could be theological, it could be literary. I've just left it under the literary since probably 5 times out of 8 it's going to impact that area rather than the other 2. All right, and then finally, step 15, write your paper. It's going to include elements of all three categories for sure. So we just listed it this way. Write your paper under each category, but you're only writing one paper. This is the overview. All right, task 1, the literary context of the book. The goal is to create a two-level outline, main points and subpoints, of the book from scratch in a methodical fashion that makes sense to you. If it doesn't make sense to you, it's not helpful to you. So make sure that it makes sense to you what you've decided. Here's some steps to getting that done. Read through the book in English 2 times, preferably using the NIV. And the reason for the NIV is because it's the most divided into paragraphs translation that I'm aware of. If you find one that's divided more frequently than the NIV, let me know, and I'll probably let you use that one. But you want to use the NIV paragraphing as a guide to decide what's a paragraph and what's not. Boil each paragraph down to one simple sentence, not a compound sentence. It needs to have one subject and verb. It can have, I suppose, a double subject is possible, but it needs to have one predicate, one combination of subject and verb. It can't be a subject and verb while another subject and verb. No, you want to have one simple sentence, not compound. All right. Basically, the reason for that is that if you find yourself wanting to do compound sentences, you probably have done one of two things incorrectly. Either you have 2 paragraphs and you need to divide it further, or you haven't boiled it down to the key point. And so one of those 2 things needs to be done to fix that. All right. You must focus on what you determine to be the most essential idea within the paragraph. You're going to write that out as one simple sentence. Analyze the structural relationship. Now that you got all your one sentences here and there on a list, analyze how they each relate to the other by rereading. This is the second reading of the text. You do your first one to boil down your sentences. You do your second one to realize the relationships. Basically, there are only 4 possible relationships: literary, logical, and abrupt. Within literary, for a letter, this will be opening, thanksgiving, and at the end, it could be paranesis or closing. These are parts of a letter based on the 5-part letter diagram for New Testament books. Under logical, there's 12 possibilities of how one clause or one paragraph logically relates to an earlier paragraph. So you want to label each paragraph how it relates to the previous. Paragraph 2 could be an explanation of paragraph 1. Therefore, number 1 works. It could be an illustration of number 1, like a sermon illustration or a narrative illustration. It's an example of what's going on in paragraph 1. Then number 2 is the right choice. Illustration. Causation. It could be the cause of what's in paragraph 1, or it could be the effect of paragraph 1. Be sure that you label those accordingly. It could demonstrate a means to the goal in paragraph 1. You got a goal or an end in paragraph 1, then you have the means in paragraph 2. So it could be an instrumentation, the instrument of getting paragraph 1 done. It could be evidence for paragraph 1. It could be a particularization, a detail. In other words, paragraph 1 is generic and paragraph 2's got a lot more detail. Particularization. It could be a continuation. For example, if you said Jack walked up the hill or something of that nature in paragraph 1, and then in paragraph 2, Jack went down the hill, well, it's just a continuation of his journey. So it's just and then, and then, and then would be keywords that you could connect those paragraphs with. That's a narrative type, but it could be a logical argumentation. This matters, and that matters, and this other thing matters too. You have continuations. Repetition is when you re-say the same things using different words. Comparison is when you say like or as something else. You're comparing paragraph 2's information with paragraph 1 somehow. Contrast. This is opposite to paragraph 1. Summarize. We've had a bunch of things in several paragraphs, and now we have a summary paragraph that just restates the main points of the preceding paragraphs. That's a summarization. Conclusion is drawing a conclusion from the evidence that was laid out in previous paragraphs or the argumentation. Then we have abrupt transition. Abrupt transition usually marks when an author moves from point 1 to point 2, or moves from body to closing, or moves from introductory materials to body. So these will mark your abrupt transitions. These help mark the points, your major points in an outline. All right, so then you're going to make the outline. And here's a key. Your stuff that you do for the first half of the step, this needs to dovetail with your outline that you create. If something's not dovetailing, you need to rethink one or the other. And usually it means rethinking the first one. Make an outline. Create major sections. Group them together if they belong together, and then you can break them into point 1, point 2, point 3, and so forth like that. And then underneath point 1, point 2, point 3, you need to have sections, the second tier points, that you've reduced your sentence into a key phrase in the sentence. So what that means is when you decide these 5 go together, and you've had single sentences for each of them, but now they're point number 1, you find a way to word that so that point 1 is a sentence, and then the subpoints are pieces of the sentence. See what I mean? All right. Create primary tier titles by composing a phrase that encompasses all the subpoints, all the ideas of the second tier points. Now, here's the next step. Once you got your outline done, compare your outline with 2 other outline types. One from a New Testament survey, such as Carson, Moo, and Morris, or some other New Testament survey, and then compare it to a commentary. It can be Moo's or it can be someone else's. Doesn't matter. Just one commentary outline and one New Testament intro or survey outline. Then here's the write-up. Provide an analysis of your outline in light of the others. How does my outline compare to the other 2 that were already existing? And this is why you need to do your work before you go look up the outlines in the others. Because once you do that, you may want to tweak yours, or you may want to comment on how yours is different and why it's different, and maybe why the other scholars made different decisions. All right, here's an example, and I have this example worked out in the text, but I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint at this time and show you how I do this in a step-by-step way. But you have this to look at in your document, okay? But we're going to define a literary unit. That's the first thing. So step 1 to defining a literary unit. You're going to read through the book 2 times, easy to read translation. NIV is the most helpful, but you can use another one if it's well divided into paragraphs. Outline the whole book. This is why we do a short book, like Galatians, for exegesis process, rather than a long book, because you'll not get done with this very quickly. Each paragraph of Greek should be a point somewhere in your outline. Reduce each paragraph to 1 subject and verb. You can have a direct object if you need it, or a predicate nominative, but you need 1 clause. All right? Analyze how each point relates to each other point and the book as a whole. That's an analysis step. Decide which outline components are the main points and which ones are subordinated. Obviously, in outlining, you got to do that. Possible structural relationships. And we have opening, the thanksgiving, the body, the paranesis, and the closing. These are the 5 parts of a typical Greco-Roman letter. There's some debate on whether there's 5 or 3. The ones that think there's 3 combine 1 and 2, or 4 and 5. All right? And the possible logical relationships, we've gone over them when we had the paper on screen. But your steps are to group together all the paragraphs of each structural component. Within the body, group together all paragraphs between abrupt transitions. From abrupt transition 1 to 2, all of those belong in 1 outline point. Use the abrupt transitions to divide between key sections of the body. Use logical relationships to tier the paragraphs under each main point. You should have 1 section for each structural element and more than 1 for the body. In other words, the body will often have 3 points or 4 points. You need to have a separate structural key point for each of those. check your outline against two sources, a New Testament survey or a New Testament commentary. The two will be different. That's the point of it. Typically, a New Testament survey has a very short, truncated outline, and the commentary will have a verbose one with many tiers. Yours is going to be a 2-tier as opposed to 3 or 4, and it should be more similar to the New Testament survey one in size, but maybe making different decisions because you're actually opening the text, dealing with the issues of how one paragraph relates to another. So it might be more similar to the commentary one in terms of actual decisions on the big tiers, tier 1 and tier 2. You can make adjustments to your created outline if you suddenly become aware of something you overlooked. Change it, fix it before you turn it in. All right? Note where your paragraph fits within your outline. And this is when you pick your one that you're going to focus on, your paragraph. You may not have this fully picked out yet, but have an idea which one you want to work on and maybe a backup one that for your paragraph out of Galatians that you want to develop for the whole term. Note where it fits. When you did your outlining, you picked it where that paragraph relates to the others. Pay attention to that. Okay? Every paragraph has a context, and yours does too. It came after something and it came before something. And those things need articulated in your exegesis. If you're building a sermon from this later, those also would be great introduction elements of your sermon. How does the text that you're looking at in the sermon fit with the rest of the text that surrounds it? How does it fit? Each paragraph needs to be interpreted in light of how it fits within the book and within its section of the book. You will keep your outlines to use later when making decisions on your paragraph. You may alter it again, and most likely will, as new information emerges. And then that's the footnote to the asterisk there. This is the example from Thessalonians. We have Paul, an apostle. It's a structural or an opening related thing. It's a structural relationship rather than logical, and it's part of an opening of the letter. So we have both of those elements here separated by a bracket. My prayers are inspired. Again, this is a structural element of letters. Usually in Greco-Roman letters, you're evoking a deity at this point, well-wishing upon the receiver of the letter. And so this is what Paul does in that place. It's part of the opening. And then we have another structural element, the thanksgiving. Anywhere where the author starts thanking God for something about his listeners or readers, that's the thanksgiving section of a letter. It's not arbitrary or random or accidental. It's part of the letter format. Then we get our first abrupt transition. That's where we transition from the structural elements to the body. And so we say, oh, that was a body, transition to body. It's also the beginning of point 1 in the body. The rest of them are related to that first paragraph. It's a logical relationship, and it's an explanation of the first paragraph of the body. All right. The next one is a logical relationship, and it's a continuation. It's more stuff like paragraph 2. Paragraph 3 is similar to paragraph 2. Then we keep going. Again, we have another continuation paragraph. And then we get an abrupt transition. And this is where Paul switches from his discourse mode to narrative mode, and he tells a story. So we get an abrupt transition, and then after the abrupt transition, we get a logical continuation, another continuation, another continuation. And then after that, we get an abrupt transition as he goes back to discourse. He left the narrative and he's moving back to discourse now. We get an instrumentation paragraph showing the means, how we're to live holy. And then we get an illustration of how to live holy. We get another illustration of how to live holy. And then we get another abrupt transition. We're moving on to a new point in the outline now, a new major point. Then we get a continuation, and then we get a conclusion. All right? We get a repetition. It repeats the conclusion using new words. All right? And then we get a structural paranesis. This one here is the general paranesis of a letter. Every letter has one of these just before the closing. Generally, do this, do that, or you guys do this and you other guys do that. That's the nature of a paranesis. Sometimes you'll get a little one in the argumentation, but that one will be always, therefore, in light of what I just said, do this, do this, do this. That one's within the argument of the letter. This one here is a general do this, until I write again or until I visit. It's not related to the argument per se. Sometimes we'll have themes from the argument. And then we get another continuation. This is still continuing the paranesis, a repetition of a previous material, and then we get another structural element, the closing. And this is the formal elements of what to do with the letter now that you finish the body. We got some structural closing elements. And then here's the outline that was developed from that. You've got main points around the structural elements. The second main point was the first abrupt transition to body. The third one was the abrupt transition to narrative. The fourth one was the next abrupt transition back to discourse. And then these are components under the discourse. And then I actually did a third level here. You don't need to do a third level, but I do have a third level under E. All right. Then we have 4. This is the instructions for living. This is the general instructions from the letter. There actually is a tiny paranesis in there, but it's not the general paranesis of the letter. Then we get the closing and the other closing elements. The letter's paranesis is in, I left it this time in the outline under point 4, then the tail end of 4, rather than making it its own section. You can do either of those. And I did that here because a lot of the paranesis did relate to the argument in the letter. So I just left it as point I here instead of putting it down there under V, closing. All right. Your decisions in the themes and relationships section should correspond to the outline you create. This is that dovetailing that we're talking about. So whatever you create for your outline and for your decisions, there should be a relationship between the two. One should inform the other, because you will have to articulate your outline at some point. And the only way you can articulate it is by what did you do for the logical relationships? What kind of logical relationship do you see there? You can always write that up as a paragraph. If you find that your outline is different, go back and correct your themes and relationships. Once you've done this for the whole book, select one of the paragraphs to be the one you will focus on, your project, your big project for the term. You're going to focus around this during the course. Be sure to pick one primary and one secondary one, because no two students will work on the same paragraph. And that concludes task 1.